But thank you for returning, those of you who are here. I suspect that attendance will continue to decline through the morning because we went from the high level of what's important down to how do you hold people accountable, and we're going to close the morning by having the auditor talk. Now, the reason that I am starting now, before there are very many people in the room, is that I have learned that there is one person I got to keep happy no matter what, and that's the head of audit. If I don't keep the head of audit happy, I'm in real trouble. So I am not going to go overtime and cut into the auditor's time. So that's why we are starting now. A lot of what you're going to see is the result of building on the knowledge that others have accumulated, as we talked about before. It's communication and together developing knowledge. So those of you who've been at these before know Kevin Riley and Tom Meredith and Terry McTaggart, because they've all done this with you in Texas at one time or another. I think Kevin last year, Tom the year before, and Terry sometime back before the dawn of time. And we steal ideas from one another shamelessly, always, and everywhere, but I figured I should give them a little bit of credit for it. There are three fundamental questions when you deal with monitoring. And those fundamental questions really are, what is our purpose? Why do we even exist as an institution or a system? What is our mission? What is it we're trying to achieve? And what are we required or mandated to do? Now, we talked a lot about that third a little bit earlier. I talked a little bit about the second as well. But we're going to spend more time on those kinds of things in this session than we did in the prior one. Because institutional success, the success of your institution, depends upon you deploying effectively the resources that you have to achieve the mission and fulfill the purpose. In other words, you're trying to figure out why you exist and what you're trying to achieve, and then your success depends on how you deploy the resources to do that. Now, when people talk about resources, they usually talk about money. And money is important, but it is not the singular resource available to you. You have your people. The number and quality of your people matters a very great deal. And the people that you're talking about are your faculty, your staff, your students, your supporters generally. Your location matters. If you're in downtown Dallas, you have a different set of opportunities and a different set of challenges than if you're in Amarillo. You know that. Your reputation. What are you known for and why? That is a resource for you. Your facilities. The buildings, the grounds, the technology, the things that you have at your disposal that you can use are resources. The program mix. What programs have you been authorized to provide? What degree programs do you have? What certificates do you award? What other kinds of initiatives can you take on within the ambit of your mission and your purpose? But all of those things are resources. If you have a medical school, you have a different set of resources than if you do not. Both money-wise and the kinds of people you have, the kinds of reputation you can build, all of those other dimensions. And yes, indeed, athletics does fit within resources. People often say to me, and I've had less of it lately, but people used to say to me, why do we even have athletics? There's all kinds of reasons you have athletics. It depends on the type of institution you are, why you have athletics. I was in a meeting day before yesterday at a tiny liberal arts college, and they have athletics, and they went to Division II. And I said, well, why did you do that? Because they're having money problems. Why did you go to Division II? And they said, well, 1/3 of our undergraduate students are in fact engaged in our athletics program. And if we didn't have that athletics program, we might have trouble with enrollment. It's a much different conversation about athletics at that institution than at the institution where I was the CFO, the University of Oregon, which goes to postseason games. And I can still remember, Oregon played Texas in the Holiday Bowl some years ago. Don't know if any of you were there. It was cold, miserable, like it can be in San Diego for the Holiday Bowl. What happens? I get sat next to an alum of the teacher program and her husband. Terrible game from Oregon's standpoint. It was an awful game. Great from your standpoint. Terrible game. End of the game, the next day, they write $1 million check. First time I'd ever met them, they wrote $1 million check. Because what happened? Athletics gave us an opportunity to communicate, and it was not for athletics, to communicate about the purposes of the university. So in fact, it's a resource. Not always a positive resource, I admit. Here's a question that I want you to ask yourselves. Remembering the purpose and the mission and the mandates, those things that drive institutional success, think about the following statement. This is lifted as a quote. Too much board time and attention goes to perfunctory review and routine report outs at the expense of a strategic focus on cross-cutting issues and other topics that receive inadequate attention. Does that happen in your board meetings? Does that happen? Are you focusing, if this is happening, are you focusing on your purpose and your mission and the proper allocation of your resources to achieve them? Instead, might you do this? Working with your institutional leadership to re-examine the resource use and the program costs to make better use of data for benchmarking performance. Boards must develop sophisticated understanding of educational effectiveness and learning outcomes. What business are we in? We are in the business of learning. Learning is both teaching and research. Learning is what students actually are supposed to do. That's, kind of nice to know. How do we know what they're supposed to do? To know? How do we know if they know it? And how has that affected them in their lives and careers? That connection is important for you and for your institution. And that came from that report. Okay, so you're on the board. You are on this board for a few years. Not all of you will be on for 19 years like Regent Johnson, but even if you are, you're setting a course for success or peril that can last for decades. So what should you know, and why should you know it? Because even though you may not be at the institution forever, you're going to set a tone and a course that will last. So the first question to ask is, what are you trying to achieve? It goes back again to your purpose and mission. What kind of an institution are you? Are you an open access institution? In other words, will you admit, enroll every student who wants to come, regardless of her or his preparation or background? There are a lot of institutions like that. More at the 2-year sector than at the 4, but there are still a lot of 4-year institutions that are basically open access institutions. If that's who you are, that will color how you develop your plan. It will color what goals you try to reach and the methods that you will try to reach them, but you will still try to reach them. Are you an institution built on the transfer of students from other institutions? In other words, do most of your students come to you older with a lot of credits from someplace else? That will affect, too, what you're trying to achieve and how you will achieve it. Are you the economic driver for your region? And this is particularly true for rural schools as well as for big research universities. Are you, in fact, the big dog in the local economy? Because if you are, that has an impact, not just what you spend, but how you deploy your programs in support of the local communities and local businesses. What your students, what your faculty, what your staff are able to do in those communities matters. Are you a big research engine? Are you developing knowledge for all of humankind? That sounds grandiose. It's not. That is what research does. We are a different place today than we were in 1944 when the research strategy was developed under the Roosevelt administration. We are a different institution. We are a much richer, not just technologically, but in many other ways, because of a research strategy that said we will invest our federal money, which a lot of the research is funded by, into the smart folks on university faculties. That was essentially a decision. Other countries made the decision to develop independent, freestanding research entities. We have a few of those, but most of our research dollars, in fact, flow through universities. It was a choice, and it has paid off handsomely in our society and our economy. If you're that type of institution, you have a particular responsibility and opportunity that transcends the local marketplace or even the state marketplace. Are you into healthcare? Several of our institutions, in fact, have medical schools or are medical schools. What they will care about is not just the education of the students, not just the research of the faculty, but also the delivery of healthcare into the community and for the community. Some of your institutions have affiliated with them some of the top medical centers in the world in certain areas. People come from all over the world to be treated here. If that's part of your mission, you got to pay attention to that as the board. What does the state expect of you? Hold up your 60 by 30 Texas plan. That's what the state is now expecting of you. The state is expecting that you will develop, by the year 2030, a globally competitive workforce and a successful society in this state that in fact will be a leader for the entire world. Because if you achieve this goal, that's what you will be. And before you say, I can't achieve this goal, look back at the prior plan. In 2000, when that plan was adopted, people were saying there is no way Texas is going to meet these goals. There is no way that it will broaden its equitable access. There is no way it will be able to do all the things that it has set out. It's one of these ambitious plans, let's set it on the shelf. You didn't believe that. You didn't believe that. You believed you could. And you did. And you did. And you'll do it again. But that is really what the state does expect of you. And so based on those things, on who you are and what the state expects of you, what specific outcomes are you trying to achieve? You look at, again, going back to who are you? Not all of these are going to matter for every institution. And institutions will focus more intensively on one or another of them based on their mission and purpose. Student access, your total enrollment, your access by region, your access by group of people, that matters. That matters actually to all of you. Who the students are varies from campus to campus, from system to system, based on your overall purpose and mission. Student success. Are students progressing? Are they learning? And are they earning? Now, people will tell you we're not in the business of preparing people to earn money. Not directly. But if they don't earn money, how will society and they function? So, yeah, you can say that learning for its own sake is a goal, but it has to be accompanied by the ability to be effective participants in society. And in the American society, that usually means employment. If you're a research institution, you're going to care about the publications of your faculty. You're going to care about the funding, because if you don't have the funding for the research, you really can't afford to conduct it. And you're going to care about things like patents and royalties and all that other kind of stuff, because they are markers of the health of your research enterprise. But the real question you have for yourselves, and every institution faces this, every one of your faculty members at a research institution wants to be a rock star in her or his discipline, and would be if only you would invest. How do you, as an institution, how do you, as the board working with your president or chancellor, define the rules of engagement under which the faculty pursue their research? You notice I didn't say, how do you pick programs? Doesn't work that way. But what are the rules of engagement for faculty as they pursue their creative interests in research? And that will help define the type of institution you can become. Medical care. Again, if you are running a big hospital or clinics or whatever, you're going to care about the outcomes there. If you're having problems of patients dying, you don't really want that. So you do care about that. And economic development. Virtually every institution cares about this to one degree or another. For some institutions, by their type, like the technical colleges, or by their location, like those in rural communities or those in inner cities, this becomes more important than, say, for an access institution in a suburb, just practically. The targets that you set and the balance among these things, again, are based on mission and state needs. You are representatives of the people of Texas. So here are some things that I think you should do. Now, I don't normally deal in the normative. I've learned long ago not to, I have 5 kids. I learned long ago not to tell them what to do and say they ought to do this. That never seems to work very well. They have to come to that conclusion themselves. It's harder right now with the 7-year-old, but that's okay. But I'm going to do it anyway. I'm going to violate my own rule and suggest some things you ought to do. You ought to strive to achieve the outcomes. You ought to keep in your mind the outcomes that you say you want to achieve. Always know what they are. Always know where you're going. Make sure that you use resources effectively and efficiently to achieve them. In other words, are your budgets and your other resources aligned with the outcomes you're trying to achieve? And watch your debt closely. Institutionally, you can get in real trouble if you overextend. And you've heard of institutions that have done that. I haven't heard of any in Texas, but there are. I have encountered others. But lately, we have to pay attention to the debt of our students. Paying attention to that is important because their success in participating fully in society is in part our responsibility. And if they are unable to do so effectively because they are burdened with debt that they can't repay, that's a problem for the institution. Again, as a representative of the people, you care about the high quality of your academic programs. That's why you exist. And you want the programs that you have to be at as high a quality as you possibly can afford to make them. Because really that is the key to success of the institution. Got to make sure you do what the accreditors tell you to do. I cannot tell you how many times institutions decide, well, they don't really understand me, and therefore I'm going to fight this. Wrong choice. Wrong choice. How do you effectively meet the challenges that the accreditors have laid out for you and demonstrate to them that, in fact, you will overcome them? Don't blow them off. And are students learning what they need, and are they completing their education as quickly as they can? And you're going to care about those things because on their behalf, it will reduce their cost and give them their rewards of participation in society quicker. On society's behalf, it's because they can participate more effectively. And on your behalf, it's because it becomes less expensive for you. You've got to make sure that students are safe and live in a healthy environment. That's especially true for those of you who have residential campuses. You are in loco parentis. We've had these debates in higher education for the last 75 years at least about what does that mean. And we've gone from trying to cosset all students and hug them to ourselves to a laissez-faire attitude that says, well, they're adults, they can do whatever they want, they're on their own, it's not our responsibility, to a kind of a balance now that says we do have some responsibility for them, and therefore we have to provide a safe environment. Most of my speech next Friday in New York will in fact be about that. I don't call it that, but that's what it's about, because free speech can challenge the safety of an environment in the current political milieu. Does the institution have a viable strategic plan, and is the administration following it? You will have adopted that plan. Is the institution actually engaged in making it happen? And are you making progress toward your share of the big goal set out in 60 by 30 Texas? That by 2030, at least 60% of your young adults will hold a degree or certificate. Are you doing your share as an institution in your community for the kinds of students you serve to make that happen? Well, in order to do that, you need to know some things. And so what should you know? Well, first I would argue that good, useful data are important. They have to be accurate, consistent, and relevant to the outcomes that you're seeking. It'll build trust between you and the administration and the rest of the community and the state if you do that. They provide you some tools to see, is management achieving what we set out to do? It allows you to understand quickly the situation that you're in, because you're getting this data all the time. It allows you to see trend lines. Are we on the trend line that we intend to be, or are we deviating from it? Are we in trouble, or are we doing well? And how are our peers and competitors doing? Because believe me, we are in a competitive environment, and I don't care what anybody tells you, it really is. And you've got to care about that, not just from the point of view of your own well-being, but in point of view of, are you achieving what you ought to be achieving compared to what others who have similar things are achieving? In other words, it's like holding up a mirror to yourself and saying, am I doing what I need to be doing? But you can't ignore the subjective. You know that. What should you know? About your market, you each are in a market. About your competitors, you each have competitors. About your peers, you each have institutions either within the state or outside the state against which you compare yourself in terms of your effectiveness and your reputation, and about yourself. And you need to know that in each outcome area that matters to you. Okay, cost and performance. This is one that people tend to spend a lot of time on. Here's where the peer comparisons help. Do you have enough or too many faculty or staff per students given your discipline mix? Compared to peers, what's your net income? This is an important one primarily for the private colleges, but it can be for publics as well. How much net income do you get from your students? And is it going up or down? Because it doesn't matter what the headline rate of tuition is. What really, in terms of the dollars coming in the door, those are what you deploy in order to, those are the resources you can deploy in order to achieve what you want, not what the headline rate of tuition is. And finally, where are you with your peers in the salaries and benefits of your key employees, and particularly your faculty? What should you know about finance? Are you living within your budget? Okay, good to know. How do you spend your money? What are the trends and forecasts? What's your debt load? What reserves do you have? How can you deploy those reserves? Because sometimes they're very restricted and other times they're not. And what are the external threats and opportunities that you face that will hit the bottom line? And do you have any significant findings on audit reports? Like the accreditors, you got to pay attention to the auditors, and the auditor's coming right after me, and he will tell you, pay attention to the auditors. What do you need to know? You should know if your activities are boosting the economic development of the state or region, if that's one of the things that you're focused on. Are you having any impact? What do employers tell you? You need to ask the president to provide you with that kind of information. How's your private fundraising going? If you care about that, not all institutions have to care too much about that. Most do now. But some rely heavily on philanthropy for the investments that they make to change their business model or to change their academic mix, become seed capital, or to provide financial aid for students, or to allow them to expand or extend or change out equipment or do other things that they need in order to keep current with the disciplines they have in order to maintain the level of excellence which they already have achieved. And again, if you're running hospitals and clinics, you care about the medical outcomes. You should know what happens to your graduates. Where do they go? What do they do? What do they earn? That's important information. Texas, not uniquely, but Texas, I think, importantly among the states, connects or tries to connect pretty well between its higher ed system and its workforce development system. I've held it up as a model for other states before. You can tell me that I shouldn't, that it's got all these problems and flaws. That's fine, but compared to other states, you're doing really well. So, but it's important to know what happens to your graduates. It's important to know, too, whether the strategies you've adopted for your initiatives are working. And it's important to deal with accreditation findings. If you've got professional programs like CPA or engineering, are your students, or nursing, are students passing the relevant exams for licensure? Who are your incoming students? In other words, who are you going to be serving for the next 2 to 4 to 6 years, let's hope it's not longer than that, in order to fulfill the mission that you have? Who are they? What are their characteristics? How academically prepared are they? Which is the remediation or developmental education question. From which locations do they come? Do they come from poverty? Do they come from different groups in society? What is their makeup in terms of gender and ethnicity? How many of them are going into STEM? And what's their background for that? That question came up to me this morning at breakfast as a big challenge in Texas as it is everywhere else. What are your transfer rates and how successful are your transfer students? Remember, Texas Code has called out transfer as an important element of what four-year institutions do. So you got to pay attention to that because the code tells you to. And what's the diversity of the student population and your recent graduate population and of your faculty and staff? You got to pay attention to that. There's increasing research is showing that students do better if the faculty with whom they're interacting share characteristics with and look like they do. And the closer you can come to that for the student body you have, the more likely you are that that student body will be successful in the aggregate. You care about graduation rates and retention rates. Now, I know that's true. I will tell you that's true. But I will also tell you if you're trying to meet 60 by 30 TX, the absolute number matters a lot. So it's not just the rates. The rates are important as indicators to whether or not you're going to get to that absolute number of graduates that you need. The rates in themselves are measures of how effective you are with the current students at kind of moving them along. But what really matters at the end will be whether or not you've graduated enough of those students to meet the goal. So don't get tricked into thinking that a 90% retention rate is all you need to do. No, you've got to graduate 20,000 students more over the next 10 years than you did in the last 10, as an example. The number and percentage of students in developmental ed and how effective are those programs. Higher ed's dirty little secret is about 60% of the students who go to our two-year schools and 40% of those who go to our open access four-year institutions and more than 20% of those who go to our research institutions aren't prepared in either math or English language literacy in ways that reach what's needed for entry-level college work. Now you can sit here and you can blame all kinds of folks for that. It doesn't really matter. Those are our students. So how can we make them successful? How do we get them through to their degrees and their learning, regardless of where they start? And So knowing the characteristics of that population and then knowing how effective your strategies for dealing with them are is important. The number and percentage receiving financial aid. You care about the wealth and the income of the families and the students that you have. In part because when you deal with financial aid, you're dealing with two things. One is the student debt we mentioned before, but another thing is this is the area that most of the institutions who are not research institutions will have the most connection with the federal government about, because most of the money comes from a variety of federal sources, some of which, as you know, are about to dry up depending upon the tax bill, but those things are important. And knowing how many of your students are engaged with that is important because of the various rules and requirements, but also because of the success you're trying to do. Because what you're doing with that money is you are giving students who don't have the resource to otherwise attend, to be able to attend, to be able to progress, to be able to learn, to be able to succeed, to be able to graduate. And so it's important to know what the characteristics are and then the debt load of your graduates. What do they make versus the debt load? What collaborations involving your institution or system are out there? Now, this is an interesting one. Higher ed has done very, very well over the years in collaborative research. We now know how to do it. We now know how a faculty at Texas A&M can be a co-PI, or principal investigator, with somebody at the University of Arizona, with somebody at the Limerick Institute of Technology, picking a campus that I was recently on in Ireland. We do that. That's the way our funding structure actually is set up now, both for the EU and the US, is to provide incentives for faculty to work across disciplines and even across institutions. Why? Largely because the view is that you can be too insular otherwise, or that you don't have all the requisite knowledge in one location. So we're pretty good at that now because we follow the money. But we're not very good, regardless of having tried for decades, at collaborating in other ways for the benefit of students. Transfer would not be an issue in Texas if we collaborated well. Wouldn't. It's an issue everywhere. I'm not picking on Texas. But we do not deploy the resources of all of our institutions in a collaborative way in order to achieve success for students. It's a hard thing to do. It's a hard thing to do because they're also your competitors, right? How do you burnish your brand if you're doing something collaboratively with another institution? But it really is at the fundamental core of what that 60 by 30 Texas plan talks about, and that's what Chair Jenkins talked about this morning. What are your enrollment trends? Up, down, sideways, different kinds of students that you've had before, same kinds of students you've had before. You've got to care about those things. The success of your online offerings. Public institutions were late to the online game, but they're there now in force. The question, though, isn't just how many students are there and whether or not the programs are self-sustaining, but what are they learning, and how does their experience and their learning integrate with and compare to that of the on-campus students. Interestingly, one of the larger public university online programs some years ago was at Oregon State when I was chancellor, and they were early adopters. More than half the students in that program were, in fact, on campus as well. And what's your progress in meeting the 60 by 30 TX goal? So the drivers are the demographics, your industry connections, the research strength that you have, your reputation, location, financial resources, the management ability of your president or chancellor and her or his team matters a great deal. It may be the single most important thing to the success or failure of an institution. The loyalty of your staff, and yes, even football. The measures have to be tied to the outcomes. You want a few of them on a dashboard, not too many. What are the things that drive your success? Make sure you're measuring that, and make sure you have added your input to what the President or Chancellor has proposed. We got about 2 minutes left. Any questions? 3? I don't know, what's this? No questions. I have completely bulldozed, steamrolled, or bored you to the point of complete catatonic state. But you are now about to have the most interesting presentation of the day. You are about to engage with your internal auditor. There can't be anything more engaging than that. I know there isn't anything more important than that, and I made sure I did not run over because I never want to come afoul of the auditor. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.